All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Av Singh, and I am with Fleming and Singh Cannabis, also with uh, Green Star Plant Products. And most importantly, today, I'm an advisory board member to the Grow Up Conference. I'm very happy that so many of you are joining us. We're expecting a little over 300 participants for today's special event, and I'd like to consider our guest as a friend of the Grow Up Conference, and we really look forward to hosting Frenchy once again, perhaps in person in Victoria. So mid June, I hope things are looking better for this pandemic, and then we can perhaps have Frenchy join us in Victoria. That's June 14th to the 16th. If it doesn't work out at that time, then perhaps in Niagara. So once again, the Grow Up Conference is going to be hopefully going live and in person at the beginning of September in Niagara. So keep those dates in mind. And without, I could probably spend most of this time just talking about our guest's journey from a young late teen in finding this plant. But I think I'm going to encourage as many people to go to the FrenchyCannoli.com website. Great information there, and websites. I have posted on the chat at the top of the chat some YouTube links and other resources that FrenchyCannoli.com offers, as well as the YouTube link. But I do want to acknowledge a little bit about Frenchy and his character. He does totally exemplify what we are looking for in the cannabis subculture. Just somebody who is so generous with his knowledge, making sure that the knowledge that he evokes and emits is open source, and he's always willing to give that knowledge. You have many speakers who come to these conferences and they'll do their 1 hour talk and then they're gone, and we miss out on all their wisdom. Frenchy continues, incredibly generous with that information, and that is something that I think we all should emulate in this sector to make it even better. And I also want to acknowledge the fine and kind work of Kimberly Hooks, the CEO of FrenchyCannoli.com, the brand, and all of her support in getting this webinar going. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Frenchy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so good morning to all. I'm going to get to my main screen, if I can. So today I'm going to dive straight up into the origin and evolution of cannabis concentrate. So first, what is exactly a concentrate? A cannabis concentrate are any products that are made from cannabis resin. May the resin be collected from the cannabis plant through a sieving or an extraction process. So it goes from dry sieve, the simplest dry sieve, to a pure isolate, and everything in between is a concentrate. And today I'm going to create a classification of it so that we can speak the same language and understand each other. First, let's talk a little bit about the trichons that are actually producing that resin. It comes from the Greek word trichoma, it meaning air, which very much look like it on a plant. And in those trichons, there is two types, unicellular and glandular. The glandular trichon produce in a plant kingdom over 200,000 compounds, from the most toxic to the most beneficial and everything in between. We as much as we know how some of those compounds create each other, like terpene and cannabinoid, we have no idea of the real power of such an arsenal that the plant kingdom has at its mean to create so much. What's very different with the cannabis plant can literally biosynthesize the two most common compounds in the plant kingdom, phenol and terpene, which are both toxic, and create 155 plus medicinal compounds. So let's talk about the origin. How did we figure out that the magic was into those little glands? And we have to go back really far in time, actually. For the longest time, we didn't pinpoint the birthplace of cannabis until last year, end of last year, where they finally could pinpoint exactly the place where Humulus, the hops, evolved into cannabis. And it's in the high plateau of Tibet near Lake Qinghai. It's the biggest salt lake today in China. What's very interesting, the birthplace of cannabis, it's right next to the biggest highway of migration of animal from the African continent to the American continent. And Siberia was the hotspot, really the place where the variety of animals, the diversity was insane. And seed plant, the main way for a seed plant to be, for its propagation, it's mammal herbivore. So the mean to really move on the continent was really, really perfect. So much that actually the cannabis plant was in Europe 6 million years ago. However, it took the plant almost 5 million years more to go into the more subtropical southern eastern Asia, and almost 6 million years to actually reach the feet of the Himalaya. And there is a very good chance that that migratory path of the plant was pretty much done by humanity. When the Humulus evolved into the cannabis in a high plateau, it was because of climatic and geographic condition. The Humulus was reaching the limit of a land where it could acclimate and climate where it could really acclimate and thrive. So it evolved into cannabis. And cannabis, the original cannabis plant was an evolution towards the grassland and the high mountain of Central Asia. That's what guided the dispersal of the plant toward Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. What's really interesting, when you reach the Mediterranean Sea, there is a fertile crescent from Egypt to along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and towards the Tiger and Euphrates River. The first civilization were born there. This is the richest earth place on earth. And the plant was there 4 million years before Homo erectus actually set foot from Africa on the Eurasian continent. So imagine a plant that is really defined by evolution to thrive in the condition of Central Asia. Our ancestors, when they reach the Eurasian continent, they step into the richest place of Earth where cannabis had been for 4 million years. You know how hard it is to hide the plant today from your neighbor? Imagine how much a person that is totally dependent on nature. Those people, when they left Africa, they were barehanded and naked. The only source of survival is given by nature. They are so fine-tuned to learn everything to be able to survive that they did that for 1.5 million years plus, and they went over 2 continents, Africa, and on the Eurasian continent, there is evidence of Homo erectus from Spain to Philippines and Indonesia. So if you think that the most important staple for a nomadic tribe and what is the base of the founder's crop is all seeds and grain. It's what packs the most nutrition, it's light, and it has a long shelf life. So most certainly that first ancestor, somewhere possibly 2 million years ago, was very interested by the seeds of the cannabis plant. But when you want to get those seeds, you're going to get sticky finger. That aromatic resin on the finger of our ancestor, that was the first concentrate ever made. It's live resin at its highest level. And since those people were so in tune with nature that everything is something to learn to be able to use and survive, well, the chance that they would have ingested a little bit of that cannabis resin is pretty high. So now, to go from sticky finger to sticky full hand of resin, there is not that much of a stretch of imagination to get there. It's a super easy technique that is really a communion with the plant to a level that is pretty amazing. Those people with the relation that they had with the plant kingdom, there is a very good chance that hand rubbing a live plant becomes the first way to collect resin. And as you see, a plant like this, that's at the feet of the Himalaya where we're still practicing hand rubbing. With your fingernail, you just have to cut down the fan leaf and just to rub gently the plant. And it's still done in India. I spent a few years in a mountain in India, renting field like that. I'm right there in the middle. And we would come year after year and hand rub the resin on our hand. And once you rub the plant, it looks very much like that. At the beginning, when you your first rub, and it has to be tender. Your hand have to be dry. You cannot have oily hand either. You cannot sweat and you cannot have oily hand. Otherwise, you don't have the tool. Then you have to really gently caress the plant. If you break the plant, you get water and you get chlorophyll. If you get water, it doesn't stick anymore. So it has to be pretty gentle. And your first layer is basically transparent, but your hand are already super sticky. And then slowly, plant by plant, your layer goes from transparent to light amber, to dark amber, to chocolate, and to a dark reddish, dark color. When you have enough on your hand like that, the person on the left has really a full hand, not yet unstick. The person on the right bottom has already taken the resin from one hand. With your thumb, you pick up on your hand the thickest part of the resin, you press, you twist, you snap, and it come white. You see how the guy, how white his hand is, and then you keep snapping. You keep snapping everything until your hand is clean. And then the problem is to be able to go to pass your ash on the other hand, on the other thumb, so that you can unstick your the second hand. And then once you've done that, we usually packed it into between two heavy sheets of plastic as flat as possible to give a very little oxidation surface to the when we were storing. And Charas looked like that. It has that grainy, almost caviar look. You get a lot of calyxes. You have a little green that is come with it. It's pretty hard to really keep it ultra clean, but you can make really full melt and rub all day long. This is a jungle. In India, you have two types of cannabis plant and more or less two seasons. There was still in the 80s in Zeus Valley wild cannabis grows that had been growing there for over 30,000 years. And the season is a little earlier, and it's a weird season because you need to keep moving. So you travel light, you walk, you find a spot where you think that you're going to spend a while, you hide your backpack in a tree, you spend the day rubbing, you camp wherever you are at night. The main problem would have been water, but the mountain is full of a little river and stuff. And in the following day, or you move further, or you finish the place where you are, and you spend weeks after weeks going from one place to the other, rubbing live resin like that. It's the relation with the plant, the experience, it's pretty unique, and I think it's the closest relation you can have with the plant as a hash maker. It's you have to do it to really understand it, and that's how really high quality Charas look in the Valley of Malana. So in my category of concentrates, I have process, the plant material, the technique, and the end product. We are talking here about manual rubbing. We do it with live resin. The tech is hand rubbing, and the end product is named Charas. And it's mainly done at the feet of the Himalaya from Bhutan to northern India. Now, how did people figure out, on the other hand, from live resin, how do you go to dry sieve? Because it's a very different game. You need tools, and you need to be able to connect that sticky resin that you can collect on your hand when the plant is live to the dry flower. The thing is, when you collect seeds or grain from a plant, you always do it from a dry plant. And the relation, when you're going to dry the plant to collect the seeds, the relation is there. Even if there is a serious stretch of imagination, when you break the flower to get the seed, you're going to get sticky finger. So there is that relation. There is something in that plant that gives you that aromatic resin. And at the same time, when you break your flower, you usually do it on a type of tool like that is still used by nomadic tribe. That must have been used. One of the oldest evidence is 100,000 years old. That must have been used from the beginning of time to separate chaff and grain. When you separate the chaff and the grain from the cannabis plant, you have that cloud of dust falling down. And this is that stretch of imagination connecting that cloud of microscopic gland to that resin that stick to your finger when you break the flower. However, they did it. To be able to go from collecting resin on your hand to actually dry sieving, you need basically agriculture or the beginning of agriculture. Agriculture was born through stage. The genus Homo has favored different places on the Eurasian continent, and going back season after season to the same place and favoring the same plant, those plants are going to thrive in those specific spots. That's how agriculture was born. There were people in the Levantine corridor in Israel who were making beer and flatbread 7,000 years before the birth of agriculture. So that's the mean to produce goods at a certain level where you are basically a semi-nomadic, give us the ability to reach that stage of the evolution where people were dry sieving. And you need also the tool. So if you look at the Eurasian continent, the birth of agriculture it's considered to have been born in a fertile crescent, but from the whole Iranian mountain, it's like that birth of agriculture was a continuous phenomenon that moved on the continent. And on the other side of the continent, you have another birthplace of agriculture, rice. Everything else, all the other founders' crops were born on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. What connects those 2 points, it's what we call today the Silk Road, which was the migratory highway of mammals and animals from African and American continent for tens of millions of years before humanity came into play. You have the birthplace of cannabis, that big white circle, and those white stars are the oldest evidence, the oldest solid evidence of the use of cannabis as a psychoactive plant. On the Asian continent, close to the birthplace of cannabis, it's all cannabis flowers. The stash of a shaman, 3,000 years old, he had 800 grams. The one a little bit higher up in Altai mountain was buried with 13 cannabis plants full over his body. The one at the pass in the mountain was actually little brazier where you were with stone, where you were burning the flower. And on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, that white star is actually the only solid evidence of the use of cannabis resin as an incense. It's also almost 3,000 years old. It was discovered in a temple, a Judaic temple in the Holy of the Holy, on an altar next to another altar where they were burning frankincense. So that was the first evidence truly that cannabis was used as an incense since the birth of civilization. What's interesting here, it's like the tools that you need to make the ash that is here on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea come or from China. The oldest evidence of silk is 8,500 years old, or Pakistan. The birth of cotton is 7,000 years old. But when you get closer, In Czechoslovakia, they find evidence of woven material, of finely woven material. It's an imprint in clay. So it's not the material itself, but it's an imprint in a clay. And the oldest evidence of using a thread and creating stronger thread is 50,000 years old. It comes from a cave in France. And it was Neanderthal who was doing the yarning. So for the tool to make ash existed over 10 millenniums ago, and we could go back possibly to 20, 30,000 years ago. Hashish looks very, very different than charas. There is not that grainy surface. You don't have that caviar feeling. You hardly see what makes the mass. This is Moroccan ash. This is Afghan ash, pressed for export, and this is unpressed Afghan ash. As you see, like it's very, very different from the charas I showed. And it's all made from dried and cured cannabis flower. So now you have a second category of concentrate. The process is sieving. The plant material used is only dried and cured. The tech is dry sieving. And the end product actually come in two ways. You have first the loose resin glands that you collect from the plant that have many, many names in America, but it would be important to agree on one. And once you press those glands with a source of heat, it becomes traditional hashish. So the principle of dry sieving. Dry sieving is made of two processes in one methodology. You have your tool, you have the material over it, you agitate to break the gland from the stock, but at the same time, you separate through the perforation of your tool to have a higher quality product, usually because of the cleanliness. When you dry sieve or when you collect charas, when you unwrap charas, the most vital element of quality is cleanliness. When water came into play, you do not work with a brittle material anymore. You can rehydrate it. The material becomes supple. So technically speaking, you cannot create contaminant. But the use of water went much further. When Mila created the bags, the sieving bags, she literally separated the two processes. Now I have an agitation, a part where I do only agitation with the water, and on the other side, I have sieve bag where I do the separation. This is the only evolution in a game that is tens of millennium old. It's something that it's very difficult to appreciate if you have not done many, many years dry sieving. The first time I saw a little washer and a bag separated, for me, it was really, really like, I just couldn't believe my eyes, what was offered to me. And from that, I created a tool where I could manipulate and control the power of water. And for me, Vortex is the best source and the best power because it only creates positivity, like it creates, you can make homeopathic medicine in a vortex of water. And it has the mean to be powerful and gentle. And now I can bring my machine to the farm and take the plant and put them directly in my machine. I do live resin. It's not hand rubbing, but this is like true live resin. The plant is live when I put it in a machine to collect the gland. But I can also freeze the flower. It's a handicap in a way because when I freeze the material, which is made of 80% of water, it becomes ice, and the mass of the ice is 10% more than the water. That means that I literally explode from the inside out at the molecular level, the plant. But when you use live plants, when you cut it and you wash it, the plant bleeds. The chlorophyll is a little bit like in a vein-like system in a plant. You cut it, bleed. And you can wash it, but it's a lot of work. When you freeze the material, you literally cauterize the scar. It's not bleeding anymore. So you just need condition that give you the ability to wash your material before it starts melting. And then you're really in a clean zone. The beauty of it, now I'm not stuck into a few farms and a few cultivars. My limitations are how much infrastructure and my ability to freeze and keep the material in frozen condition until I use it. And I can work with dried and cured material like dry sieving. So now I have another, in the sieving category, I need to add ice water sieving. And I can add live and frozen material to the plant materials that I can use, which open a lot of doors. The technique is ice water sieving. The end product is the same than dry sieving, except that when I press my resin gland, I do not call it traditional ash, even if there is no difference between. I call it ice water ash so that there is an understanding of the methodology that came behind. The methodology I use to collect the gland do not change the content of the gland. I collect the gland wall. But I think it's good for the people to understand, looking only at the end product and having only a name, the methodology that come behind. So now we have to really understand the difference between sieving and extraction. A gland is made like a fruit. It's attached to the stalk by an abscission, and it's made to fall by itself at maturity. And a trichome is a protuberance on a plant. By definition, you cannot extract a protuberance. To make an extraction, you have to take something from a matrix that holds it in its body. To give you an example, you extract gold from a mine, but when the gold is a nugget in a river, you pan it. You don't take it from a body. And it's a big misunderstanding in the cannabis industry. I collect whole gland. Those glands hold in its body not only the resin that is extracted later, but everything that created the terpene and the cannabinoid. When I crush it together in my mass of resin, there is a matrix that created the cannabinoid and the terpene. Very much like when you crush grape, you need to have the matrix that created the juice and the sugar to make wine. If you extract the juice from the grape, you can make many different amazing alcohol, up to a 90.9% ethanol alcohol, but you will not be able to make wine. to make the wine, you need that matrix. So it's like you really have to classify not only the methodology, but the end product. When you go into extraction, you take the resin from the matrix that created the resin, and you leave some behind a big part of the equation. To give you an idea, I never actually looked very much at the terpene and cannabinoid content between the ash and the rosin extracted from the ash. But when you smoke it, smoking the ash, it's a long, warm journey, comfortable, really cozy kind of bear rug and fireplace. When you smoke the rosin that you extract from that ash, it's a bang, it's speedy, and it's short. So it's like drinking the juice of an apple and eating an apple. It's different. You leave behind everything that created what you want. So the comparison literally stopped here. When you do extraction, you entering a new world that is so diverse and so huge that it's unreal. So you have just your simple rosin press. You use a little heat and high pressure to filter out through your screen the resin and leaving behind membrane and what really created the magic. But you can go further than that. If you manipulate that resin, you can change the texture and create what is called resin butter. But you can go even further than that. If you know how to use heat and pressure and time, you can literally create pure THCA, which means that you could create pure CBDA, pure CBCA, pure whatever the highest level of cannabinoids that the plant is offering. You could get to what is done with the THCA of plants that are 22% THC. And they even go further. They can literally separate terpene and cannabinoid, which it does naturally, and grow the cannabinoid into the form of diamond, into a source of terpene. So just that little non-solvent extraction, I use heat and pressure. You have a first end product that is rosin, but then you have a second level of separation where you create different, more finely separated level of cannabinoid and terpene. In the non-solvent extraction, they consider CO2 as a non-solvent extraction. The way it's used, it becomes truly a solvent. But as far as security and the danger of the use, it lowered it down very much. Whatever most of the work done with the CO2 extraction, it's mostly for oil, vape, cartridge, edible, topical, but you can reach a level further and separate to the compound. You can make distillate, isolate, and you could also separate the terpene. Then I added cryogenic. It's not really well known. It's not really very much used, but it's has to be considered as a non-solvent extraction. And now we are coming to the big boy, solvent extraction. And solvent extraction rule. Solvent extraction is the groundbreaker. They brought back concentrate on to the awareness of the American continent, at least, hardcore. And everything that happened in the concentrate world, it's because the butane honey oil extractor have created it. And it started with shatter. Then from shatter, they went into wax. From wax, they went into butter, into crumble, into the sauce, into the diamond, into the isolate, and there is no end to it. And they are so groundbreaking that there is no other category of concentrate that is not influenced in, at least in America, especially the dry, the sieving part of the concentrate. The word using everything, it's to have the feet in the door and enter the world of concentrate that the BHO extraction are using. And it's a ultimate tool used by the perfume industry to capture the most volatile terpene. So the level of quality that can be attained by using that tool, it's unreal, and we see it every day in the evolution of the concentrate that they have done. And again, you can bring it to the highest, purest level. I think the big pharma are not scared by the plant. They are scared by people who can actually create this type of extraction with a 40, 50,000 gear, and you don't need to come from MIT to make it happen. That's scary. And I'm ready for the questions. After that, you have the ethanol extraction, which is actually the highest form of full extract cannabis. If you want a full spectrum, you want the 500 compound that the plant is giving. And that is done with ethanol. When you do use only the resin, the gland, you get down to 250. When you don't have all when you break down your micron into little parts, well, you have a very small slice of a full spectrum. The full spectrum, it's really the medicinal part of it. And this is where I'm going to leave you. This is how I categorize the concentrate as simple as possible to give a basic understanding of the technique, the end product, and what type of material is used for this process.
Thank you so much, Frenchy. That was phenomenal. And I think it's important to mention to all of the panelists that the recording of this will be made available if you've registered for the event. And so that's great to go into a deeper dive onto some of this. What we've done is we've got folks way smarter than me to ask a lot of the questions. But I am going to ask the first question as we get ready to invite others. The first question that I had to ask was a little bit, we had a few people asking around the aging and preservation of hash, how you can age it. And that leads to some of the interesting work that I know you're doing with University of Guelph and Stephen Newmaster and Lachlan Cannabinerd and Rick Moriarty at High North. The Trichome Research Initiative, which is featured on your website. Can you say a little bit about that before we turn it over to?
Yes, because it's been, I'm French. We age everything. You know what I mean? It's part aging. We know it's good. So the first time I smoked aged hash was in Kathmandu, and it was a Royal Nepalese temple bowl that was 12 years old. And I still have I still have goosebumps when thinking of it. And then in India, you have like people that they are not local because they're foreigner, but they've been living there for the 15, 20 years. And every year, they collect the best of the season and they store it underground. They wrap it, put it in a metal box, dig a big hole, and store it like that. And every year, they would put the stash of the day and they would pick up the old stuff. So I kind of had an education through the 8 seasons I spent in India, where I basically smoked everything from fresh to 12 years old. So for me, it's been in my mind. I've seen the transformation. I know it gets better to a level. It's unreal. But I had never had the ability to, and the credibility to get scientists behind me and look at it. So when you want to age, for the moment, I'm playing it like I'm aging wine, okay? I know there is a chemical reaction happening inside my mass of resin because there is so much corrosivity in a terpene and so many different elements that I have seen resin absorb contaminant and transform itself many times. So for me I need to control this in an environment where there is no oxygen, no light, and at a temperature where something is happening, but I am not into the degradation level. So we have started the process. We have tested the plant for its cannabinoid and terpene, the flower. We made the ash, we dried freeze. We tested the unpressed trichome gland for cannabinoid and terpene. Then we pressed a part of it. We tested it for cannabinoid and terpene to see if there is a transformation. I work at 180, 190, 200 Fahrenheit. It's pretty hot. It's boiling water. And surprisingly, I actually gain terpene level, but all the board, except for one guyol where I lose a tiny bit, I gain in terpene. Not much. I mean, it looked big on my chart, but I thought I was maybe not losing, but at least transforming. Something was gonna happen. So that's our first element of surprise, that we are gonna have to do many tests only on this to be able to see if it happened, if it's not a fluke. And then we have the ability of having a metabolite fingerprint made of the ash. So if I have a metabolite fingerprint of the ash through the aging process, I'm going to be able to look at a very deep level what's going on, because that fingerprint is gonna change. So that's what we have started. But for the moment, it's only one type of packaging. It's only one temperature. I want to experience different type of packaging. I use cellophane paper. But cellophane paper, the way the natural cellophane paper is made, it's pretty scary. So I'm looking for something to wrap tight my temple ball so that there is no oxygen coming. On the other side, I want people to have the ability to age themselves. So we have been offered little jar that are vacuum, where you vacuum the oxygen from it. So it's not going to be perfect, but we're going to see, I want to test them to see how much anybody using those could protect their stuff at such and such temperature. And then a packaging where I have no oxygen whatsoever in it. And we are tracking basically two temperatures, the best, the optimum for a wine cellar, 55, and basically a fridge, 40 Fahrenheit.
Wow. And much of that information is on your website?
It is, everything we have done already is on the website, and on the 20th for Christmas, we will give you the second part.
Okay.
We got the result on they are done on the 20th.
Perfect.
So it's pretty fascinating because it could literally change the industry, the way the wine industry changed when they figure out the process of fermentation.
Great. Well, I hope you can see on your screen that we've invited some of your friends online here to ask you some questions, and I will turn it over to Casey.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And Frenchie, such a pleasure to meet you. I'm very humbled to be in the same virtual space as such a master and learn so much. I'm coming out of this with many more questions that I had coming into it, but it was very insightful. So thank you very much. I'm going to start with the first one. My exploration in the cannabis world started when I grew up in France as well. So hash was before cannabis flower for me, actually. Are there certain cultivars that are better for making hash? And if so, why?
There is cultivars that are better, but the definition of better is a bit difficult to pinpoint. Is better a question of quantity, or is better something specific that you're looking for? Because they're all magnificent. Yes, there is some that do not produce as well. If you look at the certain genetic like sour diesel for any hash maker, it's in the top 5. Anything that comes from the ChemDog. But you have so much diversity that the value of what you're working with, it's in the cannabis spectrum and the terpene spectrum that those plants are giving you. Soon we're going to hopefully go beyond the quantity because the plant is made to produce a secondary metabolite to protect itself. That's the name of the game for the plant. Now, where the plant is grown, define more the result than the cultivar itself. The cultivar, say for example, if you have a cultivar with a really dense buds and you want to make hash from those dense buds, the trichome glands are going to be formed only on the outside of the bud. If you grow for hash, not only your harvest time is going to be totally different, but the way you grow is going to be different. You won't lose flower. You want trichome being formed everywhere. So you need to, if you grow indoor, you need to create a whole new different type of habitat where actually your humidity is going to be a little high for those buds to loosen up. So it's like your question is very tricky because there is so much that come into play when behind that.
So, for example, just to add quickly, sativa, or what we call sativa plants, often have looser bud structures than a plant that has an indica terpene profile, let's say. does that mean that that's also reflected in the quality of hash produced by a sativa style plant or cultivar?
A tropical plant will give you, everything is different on a tropical plant. The size of the gland, the thickness of the membrane, the ratio of the monoterpene and sesquiterpene inside, everything is different. This is the beauty of it. And we need to be able to look beyond the size because we have the mean to collect the whole tree. We have the tendency to think about size because people have created a system where there is a belief that 70 and 90, it's full melt. That doesn't mean anything. It's not a question of size. It's how much resin is formed inside the gland is only dependent on the harvest time. So there is many values that we put into ash and what we collect from ash that are redundant, totally. It's like, look for, you want a good ratio, you want a good return, for sure. But it's like, do you want, what type of effect, what do you want to feel when you're going to smoke it, which is way more important. And that's the value because we have so much diversity. There is no sativa, there is no pure landrace, not in America, or the people don't show them. Because if you want an African landrace, that's 17 weeks of flowering. You don't grow that in the Emerald Triangle. You cannot grow it indoor. You need the condition for the plant to express herself at that level. We work with hybrids that are perfect for a lot of things. Focus on what do I like? How do I want to feel? Then dig up into the plant, the cultivar that can bring you that. And then if you want to go further, it's into the terpene because that's the one that really make everything happen. So once you're into the cultivar and you like those, check up if the terpenes are not compatible or not the same. And then you're going to start to know, okay, this is what I need, this is what I want. And you have a choice that's become really, really huge. It's not sativa indica anymore.
Thanks so much, Frenchy. I have a strong feeling that most of your answers will just lead to so many more questions. We've got about 15 more minutes, and I got about 5 more of your guests to ask quick questions.
That was a tricky one.
It was in a beautiful answer with a lot more questions. I'm going to turn it over to Pat Scanlon from Cantex to ask a couple of questions.
Hey, Frenchy, good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
My question kind of relates to Casey's question, and that is, as a cultivator, how do we make genetic cultivation decisions? Concentrates are the end goal for the product. What qualities are you looking for?
I'm looking for the farmer that can harvest his flower at the peak of the flowering cycle. You have 3 days. Okay? What I know you shouldn't do is look at the trichome gland, coloring, size, or whatsoever to define the peak of the flowering cycle. Okay? The flowering cycle is defined by the main metabolism of the plant. The trichomes are not part of the main metabolism of the plant. Okay? So to look at something that is not part of the main metabolism, to figure out what's happening to the main metabolism, it's not a solution. You need to look at your flower because that's what you're growing. There is a stage when the flower is just full, it radiates. All the calyxes are like pumped up. You know what I mean? It's that time. But when you grow indoor, you will never get there. Because if you do more than 4 harvests a year, I cannot work with you. it's 2 weeks before harvest time. You can have a lot, 23% THC, the highest I've had, flower. You give me the best sugar trim, protected everything that you want. I collect them. I have a lot of return, but there is no weight in my gland. There is no resin formed inside the gland while the cannabinoids are formed, which is a big question mark, this. And the closer you come to that 3 days peak window, the more resin is formed inside. By pressing the gland that you give me, I can tell you to the day how early or how late you are harvested. But I can tell you that after. I cannot tell you that. You know what I mean? It's like if you ask me to come and look at your plant, I wouldn't look at the trichome. I mean, I would look at it to see the density of it, but I would look at your flower. All my farmers, they look at their flower. I work mainly with sun-grown also, which makes a big difference. So you have to know your cultivar. You have to know your flower. And most of you are really good enough for it. It's just that you picked up a bad habit, and that bad habit is actually shortcutting you and giving you one harvest more every year, which is huge. But you have to understand that the ratio that you have in your flower, how much CBGA do you have in your flower in general? Okay? If you have more than 0.5, you harvested early. If you have over 1.5, dude, that's already 10 days. When you are in the 2% CBGA and people are super proud that they have CBGA, it's cool. Don't get me wrong, but it's not the name of the game. CBGA is a precursor of all. That you want CBGA is fine, but I do psychoactive. May it be CBD or THC, I consider them both psychoactive. Huh? So I need that transformation to be fully done to get what I want.
Does that relate to the abscission of the trichome glands then? Does those windows line up?
Yeah. It's like the coloration of your trichome gland is defined by the intensity of your light. So when it's the sun, it gets amber very fast. But the same cultivar, full sun, undercover in a greenhouse and indoor, picked at the right timing, I will have that fullness of in the resin gland. But the color, my ash, the color are going to go from yellow to dark chocolate.
Thank you, Patrick. And thanks again, Frenchie. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Tan.
Good morning.
Hi, Frenchie. How are you? It's nice to see you. My question really relates to really following from those guys. You know, you taught me many years ago about holding the gland together and, you know, collecting that full spectrum extract. I mean, what do you say to all these guys who are looking at hash as a way to maximize, you know, waste product? And, you know, is really dry sift and water extraction and, you know, your old wash hash methods, is it really something they should be looking at, or should they be just looking at hydrocarbon? And, you know, where do you see the real commercial scale? I think we know there's always a market for good old school hash. But I think a lot of people think it's going to be much bigger. I mean, what do you think is going to happen, you know, in 5 years from now?
You have to understand that there is a world market coming. America is just a little island. Okay, Canada on top of that island. The world is big. And the world smoke traditional hash mainly. Okay, everything, all the new concentrates will have a place in a world trade market, but it will never have the impact that is had here on this continent. But they have their place. It's like it's amazingly beautiful, the diversity of products that can be made with the cannabis resin. For me, it's fascinating. But our problem is we're trying to judge. We would never make a comparison between wine, grappa, or any other alcohol made from grape. You don't compare whiskey to tequila. There is a respect for the craftsmanship and the product. Doesn't matter what you like the best. That's what we miss here. There is not that appreciation of the diversity that we have. So in all that diversity on the world market, when we think about production, let me tell you about production. In Morocco, they didn't make hash before the end of the 60s. Okay? Today, they have 35% of the world market. And they do it by hand.
Yeah, and what do you yes, and what do you think about the fact that the North Moroccans now are growing new school strains like Tangi, GG4, Shish Kabari, and it's actually quite hard to get Moroccan, Red Leb, all these traditional strains. Are they all going to come back, like you said, with the global demand for the Louis XIII, the Blue Label cognacs?
The problem is we have such an impact. The cannabis community on this continent has a huge impact on the planet. We have totally polluted places where you have the oldest genetic, like India, Morocco, Pakistan, Afghanistan. It's non-stop. But at the same time, when we go to Colombia, we go and grow CBD in Colombia. We don't go in Colombia to hunt phenotype and find the next sativa that's going to rule the world market. No, we're going to go and grow CBD that we could do home. It's insane. It's like the non-appreciation of the value of land race and the value of those people, of those countries in the world of tomorrow. It's insane because that's a competition. The Moroccan, it's a question of education. For the moment, they do feminize seed because they can see more resin in their bucket. But as opposed to America and Canada, they produce quantity, but they produce swag quantity, okay? They know that they can sell it right now because it's an illegal market, but they see tomorrow and they want to make the good stuff. So on one side, you have the Western world that want to produce quantity, and on the other side, you have the countries that have been doing quantity for millennium that are looking to make quality. That's the way it is. It's
Thank
weird.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm sorry. So we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. I do apologize to all of those questions that are coming in. I do recommend that you check out FrenchieCannoli.com. Great videos and great articles. Everything is presented in the hash making process. But I'm going to turn it over to Sylvain to ask a question, and hopefully then we'll have time for Karen and Chris as well.
Cool.
Thank you.
First and foremost, thank you so much, Frenchie, for sharing today. It's amazing knowledge that we got. I could listen to you all day long talking, but since we're short on time, for you, what's the biggest impact of early harvest and late harvest when hash making?
So early harvest, you will have no resin formed inside the gland. The closer you come to peak of the harvest time, the more resin is formed inside. On the cannabinoid level, you will have a lot of CBGA that will not have transformed into CBDA and THCA and CBCA or whatever the cannabinoid profile of the plant. So you have something different. People call it more uplifting and stuff. You have a different spectrum of everything. That's all you have. So is it better? Is it bad for flower? It's difficult to judge. For hash, forget about it. You cannot make hash with plants that have been harvested too early.
Thank you so much for the information.
Thanks, Richie. Thanks, Sylvain. Next, we ask Karen to ask her question.
Hi, and thank you so much. This has been a real learning experience for me as well. So we know that the current Canadian market, that price is an issue, but putting price aside, how will legal concentrates win the hearts of Canadians? At the moment, it doesn't represent a large percentage of the market. We are looking to increase that percentage of the recreational market with concentrates. I understand quality has been a challenge for, from the perspective of the consumer. What do you think it's going to take to gain more market share with concentrates in the Canadian recreational market?
You need to have farmers that grow the plant, the genetic, the cultivars that are popular or sexy, or you need quality. You have no quality in Canada. That's your problem. And the quality of the hash starts with the quality of the flower. The quality of the flower starts with the breeder. So you have your legal market didn't take the legacy market in. As long as you don't have the legacy market feeding you the quality, I'm at the end of the chain. I can make great Bordeaux if you give me the greatest grape. I cannot otherwise. I am dependent 101% on my farmer. Everything I am, it's because of those people, of their cultivar and the dedication that there is behind. You want to be relevant on the market, especially worldwide, you need to be able to make quality. That's the name of the game. It's a drug business, okay? The first number one rule of the drug business, if you don't have the good stuff, it's going to stay with you forever and ever and ever, because the neighbor has better. And your neighbor are America, Mexico, Colombia, Uruguay. The name, the list is long, with amazing genetic, amazing laundress and stuff. They just don't have the education yet. You have the education, you have the potential, you have the genetic, and you have the know-how. You didn't tap in it quite yet. And I think you have learned your lesson.
Thank you very much.
Karen, one last question here is from Chris.
Good morning.
Good morning, Frenchie. Thank you for all the years of teaching to me. The question I have is, what about growing for hash? And everyone talks about how to make hash, how to cure it. But what about if you're growing purely to create a high quality hash or concentrate? And what are some of the tricks you've seen through the years of travel through the different countries on how farmers do that?
No, you don't understand. Those producing countries, they don't farm. It's wild. Most of the time, when they farm, they break the ground, they throw the seed before the raining season, and they harvest at harvest time. Okay? It's you guys that brought the game to a higher level because you're growing flower, technically speaking. So it's like you enter into another world. Now, is it indoor? Is it greenhouse, or is it sun-grown?
Always sun-grown, never anything else.
So here for you, if I was as a hash maker, as an extractor, give me something that is unique. Give me something that is, oh, wow. Okay? And I'm the only one having that. Then you have the market. You will never be able to produce enough even for your own market. Talk about worldwide. You just need that one cultivar that is just like, wow. Not something that reminds you of something. You know what I mean? It's like something that is really unique and you keep it for yourself.
The Coca-Cola of cannabis.
No, but there is a ton of, look at Sour D. Sour D has been the best forever. Okay? And there is many like that. There is some uniqueness that you find when you pheno hunt. And that's what we need to do, because what all the new, it's not good enough anymore. We need to backtrack to be able to get back to stable and more powerful genetic. So in a certain way, trying to figure out what is the fate of tomorrow, or picking up the one that was the yesterday, it's not going to keep you in the market. You need to hunt yourself, your own stuff. You know what I mean? And there is so many seed companies that give you that ability that it's just a question of research, basically. You know what I mean? And then how you grow the plants once you have find them. Well, if I was looking for something really sick that would be for hash, the looser the structure, the better. Simple. So you don't want something too much cushy, or you want something really that give you the most potential growth for the trichome gland.
And, you know, with that, I mean, this has been an absolutely humbling experience. Just to see the passion and the knowledge that comes out of Frenchy is phenomenal. And this is just a teaser. This is why we look forward to having Frenchy come to the Grow Up Conference, both in Victoria and then again in Niagara, because he drops gems of wisdom everywhere he goes, and really gives so much of himself. So once again, thank you so much. I'm on behalf of all of our participants.
Thank you all. Not sharing this time. Thank you.
All right.